Finally, both Italian warship units need to trace their own supply lines. Since they are warship units, a convoy is not needed. One fleet in Benghazi traces across Sea Zone 24 to the Italian unlimited supply source of Taranto. It now has full supply, so the low supply marker on it is removed. Also, because a warship does not incur a sortie when it traces a supply line for itself, one fleet remains with 5 sorties. 2 fleet in Tripoli checks despite having 6 sorties, because a warship tracing its own supply line is exempt from the cannot activate rule. 2 fleet could trace in its own hex to Tripoli, but that would only give it low supply. Instead, it traces across Sea Zone 22 to Catania, and so remains at full supply. 7.5 No supply phase. In the no supply phase, the phasing faction performs unsupplied attrition 7.5.1, followed by voluntary elimination 7.5.2, 7.5.1 unsupplied attrition. If a phasing unit has a no supply marker, do the following. Step 1. If it is a reduced strength ground unit, remove it from its location, and put it in its faction card's eliminated box. Step 2. If it is a full strength ground unit, reduce it. Step 3. If it is an air or naval unit, remove its sorties, and put the unit in its faction card's eliminated box. 7.5.2 Voluntary elimination. The phasing faction may eliminate a friendly ground unit that has a no supply marker. The phasing faction may also eliminate a supplied or unsupplied friendly air or naval unit. Exception: a unit satisfying a home defense policy rule, a 10.3.1, cannot be voluntarily eliminated. An eliminated unit is placed in its faction card's eliminated box. If it is an air or naval unit, also remove its sorties. National will is not lost if a unit is eliminated due to unsupplied attrition or voluntary elimination. This prevents the Soviet faction from intentionally eliminating USSR units to cause a very quick collapse of the USSR, thereby throwing off play balance. 8.0 Unit logistics. In the replacement phase, a unit in a hex or map box may receive replacements. In the upgrade phase, a unit in a hex or map box may be upgraded to a different unit. In the mobilization phase, a unit on its faction card may be mobilized into a hex or map box. Pay attention to the order they are performed in the sequence of play, because it affects what can be done to a unit. 8.1 Replacements. The replacements phase only deals with units already in a hex or map box. It is not when a unit is put into a hex or map box. That happens in the mobilization phase. In the replacements phase, the phasing faction may improve the condition of a friendly unit in a hex or map box. Do not forget a unit stacked under another counter. A friendly unit may be surrounded by enemy units by the time a faction gets to this phase. Such a unit can be improved. This represents replacements that made it through before the unit was cut off. To improve a unit, its country pays the production point cost listed on the player aid sheet's production table to do the following. Flip over a friendly, reduced field ground unit to its full side. Remove up to 2 sorties from an air or naval unit. 8.1.1 Replacements. Special notes: the unit receiving replacements must be in full supply and cannot be marked with a strategic move marker. A faction may spend as many production points as it has remaining, but a unit can be improved only one time per turn. Example: a German air unit with 4 sorties can remove only 2 of them, even if there are more production points available. 8.2 Upgrade. The upgrade mechanic reflects significant improvements in troop quality and/or quantity. For example, USSR infantry armies were designated as a guards after numerous battles and becoming motorized. An upgrade unit has the symbol in the top left corner of its counter. 28 Unconditional surrender to any edition use 2 rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. In the upgrade phase, the phasing faction may take an upgrade unit located in its faction card's upgrade box and replace a unit as specified in scenario instructions. Use's playbook scenarios do not have an Axis upgrade unit. However, the Axis faction card has an upgrade box in case of official game expansions or unofficial player modifications. To make the replacement, take the upgrade unit from its upgrade box and put it in the same location as the unit being replaced. The strength of the upgrade unit is the same as the replaced unit. The replaced unit is then removed from the scenario. A replaced unit cannot come back, so upgrade units will enhance your forces, not increase their numbers. USSR Motorized Guards. If a USSR infantry unit was replaced with a USSR Motorized Guards unit, the Soviet faction immediately removes a second USSR infantry unit in a hex on the map. The second unit removed from the scenario may be of any strength or supply status. So, 1 USSR Motorized Guards unit replaces 2 USSR infantry units. 8.2.1 Upgrade. Special notes: an upgrade unit gets in its faction card's upgrade box when it is removed from the turn track or if set up there per scenario setup. Only an upgrade unit in its faction card's upgrade box can upgrade another unit. There is no production cost to upgrade a unit. The unit being replaced must be in a hex or map box, be in full supply, and cannot be marked with a strategic move marker. Once an upgrade unit has replaced a unit in the scenario, the upgrade unit is treated like any other unit. Upgrade example: a USSR reduced strength infantry unit is under the Moscow fort marker in Moscow. A USSR Motorized Guards unit is in the Soviet faction's upgrade box. The Soviet faction takes the USSR Guards unit from the box, puts it under the Moscow fort with its reduced strength side face up, and removes the reduced strength infantry unit in Moscow from the scenario. It then takes a USSR full strength infantry unit from another hex on the map and removes it from the scenario. On the next turn, Axis units assault attack the USSR Guards in Moscow and eliminate it. The USSR Guards unit is taken from the hex and put in the Soviet faction card's eliminated box and not its upgrade box. To get back on the map, the Soviet faction will need to mobilize it in a future mobilization phase. 8.3 Mobilization. The mobilization phase only deals with placing new or eliminated units into a hex or map box. It also deals with buying back a surprise attack marker. It is not when units already in a hex or map box are improved. That happens in the replacements phase. In the mobilization phase, the phasing faction may mobilize a unit that is in its faction card's mobilization box. The phasing faction may also buy back a surprise attack marker that is in its faction card's surprise attack marker holding box. To buy back a surprise attack marker, its country pays the production cost listed on the player aid sheet's production table, and then puts the marker 4 turns later on the turn track. When removed from the turn track, put it in its faction card's events box. Reminder, the marker's country denotes who buys the marker. In the mobilization phase, however, any friendly unit can use or receives its benefits in an operations phase. To mobilize a unit, its country pays the production cost listed on the player aid sheet's production table to do the following. Mobilize a reduced ground unit. Exception, a USSR infantry unit or accept shock immobilizes at full strength. The USSR could quickly call upon its manpower reserves to raise basic infantry armies. Note that a USSR Guards unit is not an infantry unit. Mobilize an air or naval unit marked with 4 sorties. A unit that is mobilized is placed in a mobilization location at 8.3.1. If the location contains a fort, the unit can occupy it. Placement can be in an ELOC. Placement cannot violate stacking limits. 8.3.1 Mobilization location. A unit can be put in a friendly city in its country's mainland area. If a naval unit is mobilized, the hex must also have a port. One UK unit may be put in either the Eastern North America or Western Indian Ocean box. That's 1 in total per mobilization phase, not 1 per box. Ussr units are put in the Eastern North America box. Up to 5 USSR units may be put in the Central Russia box. 8.3.2 Mobilization Special notes: a unit gets into the mobilization box in the end of turn phase from its faction card's eliminated box, the turn track, or per scenario setup. This means an eliminated unit cannot be mobilized in the same turn it was eliminated. Also, due to the order of phases, a unit cannot receive replacements or be upgraded on the same turn it is mobilized. 9.0 Economy. Each turn, a country receives a number of production points that it may spend to do certain activities such as move ground units or conduct diplomacy. All activities that require production points, and their respective costs, are listed on the player aid sheet's production table. Prod markers, a country's production and expenditures are tracked using prod markers on their faction card's production track. Exception, the USA does not track production. It is considered to have enough production points to pay for all its expenditures during the turn. A prod 1's marker starts in the 0 box of the 1's row. A prod 10's marker, if any, starts in the 0 box of the 10's row. A prod X hash marker, if any, is put in the production multiplier box. After determining a country's production points for the turn, its prod markers are moved on the track accordingly. As a faction spends a country's production points, it subtracts the amount spent from that country's current total on the production track. If you forget to do that and can't easily fix it, just play on and have fun. Tip: playing time can be reduced by paying for all the activities you want to perform in the turn at one time during this phase rather than individually over the course of the turn. Note this only saves time if the activities and their respective costs are very quick to determine and calculate. For example, moving all ground units costs 10 out of 12 production points, and you are doing nothing else. Unconditional Surrender 2nd edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV, the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx 29. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. Important, production points are not saved from turn to turn, unused points are lost. Use has a use it or lose it economic system. This makes for easier accounting and prevents hoarding production for unrealistic activity. There is no deficit spending. 9.1 Economy Phase. The phasing faction first determines how many production points are received by each of its active countries in 9.1.1. It may then transfer production points between certain countries in 9.1.3. 9.1.1 Production points: any country that is listed in, or which has a prod X hash marker in, its faction card's production multiplier box receives production points equal to its factory count 9.1.2 and multiplied by the value in the box or on the marker. Exception, if the Moscow Treaty policy is in effect, the USSR receives production points equal to its factory count. In use, the multiplier value is 2. The rule has been written generically in case of official game expansions or unofficial player modifications. Example, the Italian prod X2 marker is in the Western faction's production multiplier box, and its factory count for the turn is 5. Italy receives 10 production points for the turn. Each other country receives production points equal to its factory count. The maximum number of production points a country can have in one turn is 59, as per the production track. Any additional points are lost. 9.1.2 Factory count. To determine a country's factory count, count the number of friendly factories in its own mainland and overseas areas. Remember to count factories in disputed areas that were ceded to it to 2.2. The total is its factory count. Exceptions: Germany, UK. and USSR 9.1.2.1. Important, a country does not count factories in a different country, even if it occupies those hexes. Example, a German ground unit is in Paris. When counting factories for Germany, the factory in Paris is not counted. A country's production does not increase because it conquers territory. Exploitation did occur, but a country's overall economy did not dramatically increase because of it, at least in the designer's opinion. On-map factory count track, France, Germany, Italy, UK, and USSR each have a FAC count marker. It is put on its faction card's on-map factory count track in the box listed in the scenario setup. Other countries do not need an on-map FAC count marker because they have few factories, often only one. The value of the box occupied by a country's FAC count marker is that country's factory count value. Exceptions, Germany, UK, and USSR 9.1.2.1. When control of a factory changes during the turn, its country's FAC count marker is moved on the track accordingly. Example, France's FAC count marker is in the on-map factory count track's 6 box. During the operations phase, a German infantry unit moves into Paris, putting it under Axis control. France's FAC count marker is moved to the 5 box. Germany's FAC count marker is not moved. 9.1.2.1 Factory count special cases. To determine the factory count for Germany, UK, and USSR, do the following. Note this is a value calculation. Do not physically move a country's markers on the on-map FAC count track or extra factories track. Looking at the on-map factory count track, find the value of the country's FAC count marker, and then subtract the value of its FAC lost marker. If its FAC lost marker is not on the track, subtract 0. A total less than 0 is raised to 0. To the result determined above, add the value of all of that country's markers on the extra factories track. If it has no markers on the extra factories track, add 0. The final result is that country's factory count. To summarize, the Germany, UK, and USSR FAC count formula is on-map factory count minus factories lost. If this total is less than 0, raise it to 0, plus extra factories. Example, on the on-map factory count track, the UK FAC count markers value is 6, and its FAC lost markers value is 7. On the extra factories track, the UK Commonwealth trade markers value is 3. 6 minus 7 is less than 0, so the result is raised to 0. Then, 0 plus 3 equals 3, so the UK's factory count is 3. 9.1.2.2 Factory count special notes. No supply line or movement path trace is needed from an overseas area to count a friendly factory located there. A friendly factory with a bombed marker on it is included in the on-map factory count. A bombed marker does not affect the factory count. Instead, it is a strategic warfare combat DM. During the turn, losing or regaining control of a country's factory does not affect the number of production points that country has already received that turn. The number of factories for each country, based on 1939 borders, is listed on the country list 16.0. Scenario instructions may list a different amount to use for that scenario. 9.1.3 Transfer production points. After determining the production points for all its factions countries, a phasing Germany, UK, USA, and USSR may transfer its production points to any number of its factions' active countries. Exception, the UK and USA cannot transfer points to each other. That is handled via the Lend-Lease to UK rule. A country may receive a maximum of 1 production point per economy phase. For each transfer, decrease and increase each the respective country's production points accordingly. Since the USA has no production points to track, just increase the other country's value by 1. 9.2 Strategic warfare. Strategic warfare abstractly represents trade wars, U-boat activity, strategic bombing, partisan activity, etc. Strategic warfare is fought between the Axis and Allied factions in the strategic warfare phase. It affects Germany, UK, and USSR production by moving its FAC lost marker on the on-map factory count track. The FAC lost markers value decreases a country's factory count. 9.1.2. Important, FAC lost markers are put on a faction's on-map factory count track due to the East invaded a 13.3 and West invaded a 13.8 conditional events. 30 Unconditional surrender to any edition use 2 rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. Strategic warfare is resolved after production points have been determined for the turn. Therefore, the production point impact due to strategic warfare is felt the turn after it is fought. 9.2.1 Strategic warfare phase. In the strategic warfare phase, do the following. Step 1. If the USSR FAC lost marker is on the on-map factory count track, and the Moscow Treaty policy is not in effect, resolve a strategic combat between the Axis and Soviet factions using the combat resolution sequence 5.1. The Axis faction is the attacker. Step 2. If the UK FAC lost marker is on the on-map factory count track, resolve a strategic combat between the Axis and Western factions using the combat resolution sequence 5.1. The Axis faction is the attacker. Step 3. To remove all bombed markers, if any, on the map. Be sure to resolve strategic warfare involving the Soviet faction first, if applicable, as this may alter the Western faction's decision to commit an event marker to its strategic warfare resolution. 9.2.2 Strategic warfare special notes. Important, a FAC lost marker on the on-map factory count track cannot go below the 1 box or above the 9 box. The Allied factions do not perform their own strategic warfare. Strategic warfare example, Brest, in France, is under Axis control, and a German air unit is in Stavanger in Norway. Also, on their respective on-map factory count track, the Germany FAC lost marker is in the 1 box, and the UK FAC lost marker is in the 4 box. The USSR FAC lost marker is not on its track. First, the Axis faction checks for the USSR FAC lost marker. It is not on the Soviet on-map factory count track, so there is no strategic combat resolved against the Soviet faction. The Axis faction then checks for the UK FAC lost marker. It is on the Western on-map factory count track, and so strategic combat against the Western faction must be resolved. The Axis faction is considered the attacker for the combat. It goes through the combat resolution sequence, and looking at the strategic combat DM list on the player aid sheet, determines it has a +3 DM +2 for an Axis port, Brest, in C Zone 7 and +1. For an Axis air unit in a port, Stavanger, in C Zone 3. The Western faction determines it has no DM. Each side rolls a die, and adds its own DM to its own die roll result. The Axis faction's die roll result was 3, to which it adds the Axis +3 DM, for a final modified result of 6. The Western faction's die roll result was 6, to which nothing is added. Looking the CT, the attacker's result of 6 is cross-referenced with the defender's result of 6. The CT combat result is diamond symbol. Looking at the strategic combat results list on the player aid sheet, a diamond symbol states the value of the FAC lost marker for Germany, and the respective allied faction is decreased by 1. The UK FAC lost marker is then moved to the 3 box on its on-map factory count track. However, the Germany FAC lost marker is not moved because a FAC lost marker cannot be moved below a value of 1. If the Germany FAC lost marker had been in the 2 box, it would have been moved to the 1 box. 10.0 Politics. The politics that occurred during WW2 were more unexpected than they are often considered in hindsight. Therefore, Use takes an unscripted approach and simulates this chaotic period by creating tension in a player's political decision-making. 10.1 Declare war. In the declare war phase, the phasing faction may declare war on any number of neutral countries at 10.1.1. Independent of declaring war on a country, the Axis faction may declare war on an allied faction, 10.1.2, in order to end the appeasement or Nazi-Soviet pact policy. The allied factions cannot declare war on a faction. 10.1.1 Declare war on neutral country. Important, remember to check prohibitions. 10.1.1.1. The phasing faction may declare war on any number of neutral countries. When war is declared on a country, it is activated and joins an enemy faction per country. Activation of 13.1. That country is immediately set up before the next declaration of war is made. A faction can declare war on a country that contains a friendly or enemy pro-faction or strict neutrality marker in it. War is not declared against an active country. Unless prohibited by a policy, an active country may move into and attack an enemy country. Likewise, it may be moved into and attacked by an enemy country. Example, Germany, France, and the UK start a scenario as active countries and appeasement is in effect, preventing these countries from fighting each other. At no point during the scenario, even after appeasement ends, does France or the UK declare war on Germany, or vice versa. 10.1.1.1 Declare war on country prohibitions. If both the appeasement and Nazi-Soviet pact policies are in effect, the Axis faction cannot declare war on a country. If the Axis faction wants to attack a country, it must first declare war on a faction, 10.1.2, or wait for either or both policies to end by some other means as see 10.3.4.1 and 10.3.5.1. If either the appeasement or Nazi-Soviet pact policy is in effect, both the Western and Soviet factions cannot declare war. Yes, either policy affects both allied factions. If the Moscow Treaty policy is in effect, the Soviet faction cannot declare war. 10.1.2 Declare war on faction. Important, while the appeasement, 10.3.4, or Nazi-Soviet pact. 10.3.5 policy is in effect, the Axis and respective allied faction cannot attack each other or move into each other's countries. The phasing Axis faction may declare war on the Western faction if the appeasement policy is in effect, and or declare war on the Soviet faction if the Nazi-Soviet pact policy is in effect. Declaring on a faction ends its respective policy. War is not declared, nor is it required, against an allied faction if its respective policy has already ended, for example, due to the policy evaluation marker of 15.21. Declare war. Example, it is September 1939. All countries except France, Germany, UK, and USSR are neutral, and the appeasement and Nazi-Soviet pact policies are in effect. Unconditional Surrender 2nd edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV, the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx31. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. The Axis faction goes first in the phase, and its player decides that it wants to attack Poland now, and then invade the USSR in 1940, to delay triggering the East Invaded Conditional Event, 13.3. Because both policies are in effect, the Axis cannot declare war on a country, 10.1.1.1. Therefore, it first states it is declaring war on the Soviet faction. That ends the Nazi-Soviet pact, which allows the Axis to declare war on a country, 10.1.2, and allows the Axis and Soviet factions to fight each other. In addition, with that policy no longer in effect, and with appeasement still in effect, any neutral country the Axis faction declares war on automatically joins the Soviet faction, 13.1.1. With the pact ended, the Axis faction declares war on Poland. This activates Poland, which joins the Soviet faction, and its counters are set up as per the country setup of 13.1.2. The Axis faction could then declare war on more countries, but states it will not. The Western faction goes next in the phase. However, since appeasement is in effect, it is prohibited from declaring war. So the Western faction skips the phase. The Soviet faction goes next. While it is allowed to fight the Axis faction, the appeasement policy also prohibits it from declaring war, so the Soviet faction also skips the phase. Why? This prohibition prevents allied player from activating countries and causing them to join the Axis faction, which might trigger conditional events that would upset play balance. For example, if it were allowed in this situation, the Soviet player would declare war on Estonia to trigger the East invaded event and get USSR units into play sooner. 10.2 Diplomacy. Except for the USA, or as otherwise listed in a scenario setup, use does not assume a neutral country leans in favor of one faction or another. For example, Italy is not pro-Axis. It was decided to follow this concept because the politics of the era were volatile, and it made for a much more interesting game. One opaque container, called the Diplomacy Cup, is required for diplomacy. It is not provided with the game. Sorry. In the diplomacy phase, the phasing faction may spend production points to work with diplomacy-related event markers. These markers affect the political alignment of a neutral country, cause a neutral country to join a faction by activating, cause a USSR disputed area to be ceded to the USSR, or result in nothing happening. Diplomacy-related markers are area seized 14.2, no event 14.9, political failure 14.11, political success of 14.12, and pro-faction 15.19. 10.2.1 Diplomacy phase important. On any turn, the diplomacy phase is skipped if the appeasement, Nazi-Soviet pact, and Moscow Treaty policies are all not in effect. If everyone is a shootin', ain't no one a talking. Otherwise, if at least one of those policies is in effect, all factions may participate in the diplomacy phase. One time per diplomacy phase, a phasing faction may spend 5 production points to do one of the following. A faction may look at the markers in the diplomacy cup before deciding what to do. Randomly pull one event marker from the diplomacy cup and resolve it as per pulled marker resolution 10.2.2. From the map's diplomacy cup marker holding box, take any one marker of its choosing a C exception below, and put it in the diplomacy cup. Then, if there is a no event marker in the holding box, it must take one of them and put it in the diplomacy cup. This prevents a faction from guaranteeing what can be pulled from the cup on a future draw. Exception: the area seized marker cannot be selected if the Nazi-Soviet pact policy has ended or all USSR disputed areas are ceded to the USSR. Tip: if either of those situations is in effect, remove the area seized markers from the scenario to avoid accidentally choosing them. If an event marker is pulled and nothing happens as a result or whatever the reason, the production points are lost. The Axis faction spends Germany production. The Soviet faction spends USSR production. The Western faction spends UK production if the USA is not active. If the USA is active, the Western faction spends USA production. All markers in the Diplomacy Cup and Diplomacy Cup marker holding box remain in their respective location unless moved due to an action associated with the above bullets. Nothing else causes their placement or removal, including the ending or starting of a policy. Example: it is June 1941. The appeasement policy has already ended, and the Axis faction declares war on the Soviet faction to end the Nazi-Soviet pact, thus causing future diplomacy phases to be skipped. There are 3 markers in the Diplomacy Cup, and 7 markers in the Diplomacy Cup marker holding box. These markers remain there for the rest of the scenario unless the Moscow Treaty goes into effect. If that occurs as starting the diplomacy phase again, the markers still stay in their location unless moved due to an action performed in a diplomacy phase. 10.2.2 Pulled marker resolution. Put the pulled marker into the map's Diplomacy Cup marker holding box. Exception: the pro-faction, or area seized marker, as stated in its result below. Then apply the marker's result below. Area seized, apply the area seized event 14.2, unless the Nazi Soviet pact policy has ended or all USSR disputed areas are ceded to the USSR, in which case remove this marker from the scenario, and pull another marker from the Diplomacy Cup. No event occurs, continue with play. Do not pull another marker from the cup. Political failure, apply the political failure event 14.11. The faction that applies it depends on which pulled the marker. If an allied faction pulled it, the Axis faction applies the event. If the Axis faction pulled the marker, the Soviet faction applies the event if the appeasement policy is in effect and both the Nazi-Soviet pact and Moscow Treaty are not in effect. Otherwise, the Western faction applies it. Political success, the phasing faction applies the political success event 14.12. Pro-faction put this marker aside for possible later use with other unused counters, and then do the following. If the phasing faction pulled a marker with an enemy faction on it, no event occurs, continue with play. Do not pull another marker from the Diplomacy Cup. If the phasing faction pulled a marker with a friendly faction on it, it applies the political success event 14.12. 32 Unconditional surrender to any edition use 2 rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. Diplomacy phase example, it is October 1940. Appeasement has ended, but the Nazi-Soviet pact is in effect. If the Nazi-Soviet pact had also ended, the diplomacy phase would be skipped by all factions. Each faction has 10 production points available to spend. In the Diplomacy Cup are the following markers: 3 no event, 2 political success, 1 political failure, 2 pro-axis, and 1 area seized. On the map, in the Diplomacy Cup marker holding box are the following markers: 3 no event, 1 political success, and 1 area seized. The Axis faction goes first. It decides to spend 5 production points to randomly pull a marker from the cup. It draws the area seized marker, to the joy of the Soviet faction, so the Axis faction puts the marker on the map in the Diplomacy Cup marker holding box, and then the Soviet faction applies the area seized event. The Axis has 5 production points left, but no faction can spend more than 5. In the diplomacy phase, so it is finished. The Western faction goes next and decides to also pull a marker out of the cup. It draws a pro-Axis marker, making the Axis faction angry. A pro-faction marker is not put on the map in the holding box, but instead set aside with other unused markers. Since the marker contains an enemy faction on it, the Western faction is now done. Though the Western faction did not directly gain something from the draw, it did deny the Axis faction from possibly getting a political success in a later draw. Sometimes in use, it is not what you gain from something, but what you deny your opponent. The Soviet faction finally goes, but instead of pulling a marker from the cup, it decides to take one of the area seized markers in the holding box and put it back into the cup, so there is a chance it will be pulled out in a future turn. It does this, and then because the holding box contains a no event marker, it must take one of them from the holding box and put it back into the cup. 10.3 Policy rules exist so players act within reasonably historic limits. For example, the home defense policy keeps Germany from unrealistically stripping its western border of units, because the Western faction cannot attack it due to the appeasement policy. A policy has a specific set of rules which may put limits on what a faction can do with its units and markers, alter a country's national will, or prevent an allied faction from declaring war. Policies are a key play balance element of the game. Try not to forget them when playing. Important: if a policy is in effect, its rules cannot be voluntarily violated. If a policy ends, all its rules are immediately no longer in effect. Example: while the appeasement policy 10.3.4 is in effect, USSR national will is reduced by 40. Once appeasement ends at 10.3.4.1, immediately add 40 to the USSR's national will. Policies are home defense at 10.3.1, cooperation limits 10.3.2, neutral non-violation 10.3.3, appeasement 10.3.4, Nazi-Soviet Pact at 10.3.5, and Moscow Treaty 10.3.6. Scenario instructions state which policies are in effect for that scenario. 10.3.1 Home defense. A rule listed here is in effect for the respective country during its faction's strategic movement phase and operations phase. A unit satisfying a rule below cannot be moved, voluntarily eliminated, nor repatriated, unless that rule is already fully satisfied by other units, or if the unit will definitely satisfy that rule at the end of its movement. It has enough MPs, no chance of interdiction, etc. Each country except Germany, UK, USA, and USSR. A country must keep at least one of its ground units within 3 hexes of, or anywhere within, its country's mainland area. France conditional: until the West invaded conditional event occurs, a French unit occupying a fort cannot move. Germany East Front: Germany must keep at least 2 of its air units and 3 of its field ground units within any of the following locations. All units do not have to be in the same country. Prussia, Lithuania, Poland, or USSR including occupied USSR. Germany, in a hex having a border with a country listed above. Germany West Front: Germany must keep at least 2 of its air units and 3 of its field ground units within any of the following locations. All units do not have to be in the same country. Belgium, Great Britain, Denmark, mainland France including occupied France or Vichy, Netherlands, or Norway. Germany, in a hex having a border with a country listed above. Germany conditional: if the USA is a Western country, and the Moscow Treaty policy is not in effect, a German air or field ground unit anywhere in Germany applies to both the West Front and East Front policies above. This reduces the total number of units needed to satisfy both those rules. UK Maine: the UK must keep at least 1 of its air units and 1 of its ground units within 3 hexes of, or anywhere within, Great Britain, the Eastern North America box, or North Atlantic Ocean box. UK conditional: until the Mediterranean crisis or West invaded conditional event occurs, a UK unit in a UK overseas area cannot move. USSR Maine: it must keep at least 2 of its air units and 5 of its ground units within 3 hexes of, or anywhere within, the USSR. USSR conditional: until the East invaded conditional event occurs, a USSR unit occupying a fort cannot move. 10.3.1.1 Home defense not satisfied. At the start of its faction's strategic movement phase and again at the start of its operations phase, if a country is not satisfying a home defense policy rule above, its faction must attempt to satisfy that rule. For each unsatisfied rule, the faction chooses and repatriates a 10.4 the required unit from a hex and or map box and puts it in a location that satisfies that rule. It continues to do this until the rule is fully satisfied or the necessary unit or location is unavailable. After all possible repatriation, if the rule is still not satisfied, continue playing that phase. There is no other impact. 10.3.2 Cooperation limits. A Soviet counter cannot attack, move, retreat, trace a path, nor be placed in France or the UK, including its overseas areas. It is allowed in other Western countries. Unconditional Surrender 2nd edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx 33. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. A Western counter cannot attack, move, retreat, trace a path, nor be placed into the USSR, including occupied USSR. It is allowed in other Soviet countries. Any country's counter cannot attack, move, retreat, trace a path, nor be placed into a different, active friendly country. Exceptions: a supply line can be traced through any friendly country. A unit using strategic movement can move through, but not end its movement in a different, active friendly country. This policy does not apply to French, German, UK, USA, or USSR counters. Their counters can be in any friendly country. A unit using naval movement through a canal can move through, but not end its movement in the different, active friendly country. A ZOC extends into any friendly country. 10.3.3 Neutral non-violation. A move, retreat, or traced path cannot go into a neutral country. 10.3.4 Appeasement. An Axis counter cannot move, retreat, trace a path, nor be placed into a Western country. Western and Axis units cannot attack nor intercept each other. A Western counter cannot move, retreat, trace a path, nor be placed into an enemy country. Neither the Western faction nor Soviet faction can declare war. A Western unit must end its movement in its own country or a map box unless the policy evaluation marker is on the turn track. USSR national will is reduced by 40. Exception: this does not apply if the USSR collapsed at any point in the scenario. 10.3.4.1 Appeasement ends. This policy ends when one of the following occurs. The Axis faction declares war against the Western faction. A die roll result of 4 to 6 occurs after the policy evaluation marker is taken off the turn track. The absent or pact ends marker is removed from the turn track. 10.3.5 Nazi-Soviet Pact. An Axis counter cannot move, retreat, trace a path, nor be placed into a Soviet country. Soviet and Axis units cannot attack nor intercept each other. A Soviet counter cannot move, retreat, trace a path, nor be placed into an enemy country. Neither the Western faction nor Soviet faction can declare war. A Soviet unit must end its movement in its own country or a map box unless the policy evaluation marker is on the turn track. France national will is reduced by 10. 10.3.5.1 Nazi-Soviet Pact ends. This policy ends when one of the following occurs. The Axis faction declares war against the Soviet faction. A die roll result of 4 to 6 occurs after the policy evaluation marker is taken off the turn track. The absent or pact ends marker is removed from the turn track. 10.3.6 Moscow Treaty. The disputed area border within the USSR is in effect. The USSR area west of that border is the occupied USSR. The USSR area east of it, and the central Russia box are the active USSR. Occupied USSR is considered a conquered country. Exception: it is considered part of the active USSR for purposes of the political failure or political success event. In the economy phase, the active USSR receives production points equal to its factory count. Do not multiply. The Soviet faction cannot declare war. An Axis counter cannot attack, intercept, move, retreat, trace a path, nor be placed into the active USSR. A Soviet counter cannot attack, intercept, move, retreat, trace a path, nor be placed into occupied Russia. A USSR counter cannot attack, intercept, move, trace a path, nor be placed outside of the active USSR. Exception: it can be put on the Soviet faction card or turn track. 10.3.6.1 Moscow Treaty ends. The Moscow Treaty policy ends when a die roll result of 4 to 6 occurs after the Moscow Treaty marker is taken off the turn track. If the policy ends, see policy ends in Moscow Treaty 15.14. Policy examples: home defense Germany East Front, Poland is a neutral country. A German air unit is in Königsberg. Also, 2 German air units and 3 field ground units are in Germany in hexes that have a border with Poland. The Axis faction activates the air unit in Königsberg and moves it 10 hexes toward France. The Axis faction can do this because the 2 air units in Germany fully satisfy the air requirement part of the Germany East Front rule. Neutral non-violation: to move toward France, the activated German air unit had to move over some water hexes in the Baltic. See because it was prohibited from moving into a neutral Poland. Due to this policy. Home defense Germany East Front, same situation as above except there is no German air unit in Königsberg. The Axis faction activates one of the 2 air units in Germany and moves it to East Prussia. It cannot move into Poland, so it must move over water hexes to get to East Prussia. Even though the air unit would not normally be allowed to move, because it is one of the 2 air units satisfying the East Front rule, it can move because at the end of its movement the air unit requirement part of the East Front rule will be fully satisfied. The Axis faction now activates one of the 3 German ground units and moves it toward France. While moving it, an allied player reminds the Axis player that the East Front rule requires 3 field ground units. The Axis faction must either adjust the move so it ends in a hex that borders Poland, or it must put the ground unit back in its starting hex and not move it at all. Home defense Germany Conditional: the USA is active and the Moscow Treaty is not in effect. A German air unit is in Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw. The air requirements of both the Germany West Front and East Front rules are satisfied, because the German air unit in Berlin is counted for each rule. 34 Unconditional surrender to any edition tilde use 2 rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. Home Defence UK Maine, a UK air unit is in London, and a UK ground unit is in Calais. This rule is fully satisfied. Home Defence not satisfied, it is SEP 39. At the start of the Axis operations phase, Germany has 3 field ground units on the French border in Germany satisfying the Germany West Front rule. In the Western operations phase, France attacks one of the German units and causes it to retreat away from the French border. Germany is not violating the West Front rule at this time because it only applies during an Axis strategic movement phase or Axis operations phase. In October 39 at the start of the Axis strategic movement phase, the Axis faction is still not satisfying the West Front rule, so it repatriates a field ground unit in Poland and puts it in a hex that borders Denmark and is not in an EOC. That German ground unit cannot be activated in the upcoming Axis operations phase. Cooperation limits, appeasement is not in effect. Belgium and France are Western countries. A Belgian ground unit cannot move into France. A French ground unit can move into Belgium because French counters are an exception to this policy. Appeasement, Belgium and France are Western countries. A Belgian or French ground unit does not exert AZFC into Germany. Similarly, a German ground unit does not exert AZFC into Belgium or France. Also, a French unit cannot end its movement in Belgium and vice versa. 10.4 Repatriation. If a rule states a unit is repatriated, the owning faction removes the unit from its current location and puts it in or adjacent to a friendly city in its country. No movement path is traced. If a marker is repatriated, it is placed as per that marker's rule. If another rule lists a different placement location, follow that rule. The placement cannot violate stacking limits, be intercepted, be in a prohibited hex, or be in a hex with an EOC or enemy marker. If there is no eligible location, the unit is put in its faction card's eliminated box. A repatriated unit cannot be activated in that turn. If currently activated, immediately end that unit's activation. A repatriated air or naval unit adds 1 sortie to its total. 11.0 Weather. Weather represents climate and ground conditions. There are not many weather-specific effects, but they have a significant impact on combat and operations. There are 3 types: weather, fair, poor, or severe. After the weather for a specific weather zone is determined, it applies to all hexes within that zone for the rest of the turn. Weather does not affect a map box. 11.1 Weather phase. The Axis faction rolls 1 die each for the cold, mild, and warm weather zones. It finds the result on the player age sheet's weather table based on the turn's month and puts a weather marker in that zone's respective box on the map's weather track. Exception, if the Russian winter marker of 15.23 is in the cold zone's pool box. Do not roll for the cold zone. Instead, put its marker in the severe box. When rolling weather for the April, June, or November turns, use the row on the weather table that matches the prior month's weather. The location of a zone's weather marker on the track will remind you what it was. The Allied factions do not roll for weather. Example, it is April 42. The Axis faction declares it is rolling for the cold zone and looks at the weather track to see its weather marker is located in the poor box, indicating the March weather was poor. It rolls a 5 and looks at the April and March poor row within the cold zone section of the weather table. It finds a result from 4 to 6 is listed under severe, and then moves the cold zone's weather marker to the severe box. The Axis then rolls a 1 for the mild zone, which also had poor weather in March. On the April and March poor row within the mild zone section, a result of 1 is listed under fair. Finally, the Axis rolls a 3 for the warm zone, which had severe weather in March. On the April and March severe row within the warm zone section, a 3 result is listed under poor. 11.2 Poor severe weather effects. Poor weather effects in combat may feel worse than severe effects, especially for the attacker, and sometimes they can be. However, poor weather still allows for more extreme combat results on the CT. Severe mitigates extreme combat results, but it is also less predictable in terms of who will win. A ground unit cannot conduct a mobile attack against an enemy ground unit in a hex affected by poor or severe weather. A unit can only assault it. It costs 2 instead of 1 additional movement points to initiate a ground combat against a unit in a hex affected by poor or severe. Otherwise, movement is not affected by weather. A ground unit has a combat -1 DM if attacking a unit in a hex affected by poor. The tank unit, air support, and naval support ground combat DM is +1 instead of +2 if defending in, or attacking a unit in, a hex affected by poor. An air or naval unit has a combat -2 DM if defending in, or attacking a unit in, a hex or sea zone affected by poor. An amphibious invasion cannot be performed against a hex affected by severe. There is no tank unit or air support ground combat DM if defending in, or attacking a unit in, a hex affected by severe. A faction's modified combat result is divided by 2 round up, if defending in, or attacking a unit in, a hex affected by severe. 12.0 Turn completion. 12.1 Victory check. Phase check. If a faction has achieved the scenario's victory conditions. Unless the scenario states otherwise, victory can occur in any turn. 12.2 End of turn phase. Step 1 Advance the turn marker on the turn track to the next turn. If a counter is in the entered turn track box, put it in its respective location on the map, on a track, or in a faction card box as per its rule, or its location listed in the scenario setup. Exception, do not remove the scenario ends marker. A marker is usually put in either its faction card's events box or on a track. A unit is usually put in its faction card's mobilization box. Step 2. Move all counters in a faction card's eliminated box to its mobilization box. Unconditional Surrender 2nd Edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV 31 August 2020 V03.docx35. Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. 13.0 Conditional Events. Conditional events can be looked up as needed rather than memorized. It is good to remember the triggers for conditional events, but there is a brief list of them on the player aid sheet. While playing, one or more of the following events may occur when its trigger condition happens. If an event's trigger condition happens, immediately check its rule, and perform the listed actions. If a conditional event or event marker requires an action that is impossible to complete, ignore that specific action. Example, if an event requires the selection of a neutral country, but there are no neutral countries left, nothing happens, and play continues. If a conditional event is triggered during a unit's activation, resolve the conditional event first, and then continue with the unit's activation, provided the conditional event did not end the unit's activation. Example, after expending 5 movement points, a German ground unit moves into Zagreb and causes the conquest of Yugoslavia. After performing the steps of conquered country of 13.2.2, the German ground unit can continue moving. If more than one conditional event is triggered at the same time, perform the rules in numeric order from lowest to highest. Example, USSR Collapse 13.2 and USSR Northern Border 13.6 occur at the same time when an Axis ground unit moves into Volkhov Hex 1548. Rule 13.2 is performed before 13.6. If a conditional event happens while resolving another conditional event, complete the actions of the newly triggered event, and then continue with the previous event. Example, East invaded a 13.3, is being resolved, and the Axis faction uses its political success to activate Finland. Finland is now set up per country setup, 13.1.2. When a Finnish ground unit is put in Finland, USSR Northern Border is triggered at 13.6. USSR Northern Border is resolved, followed by the completion of country setup, and then the completion of East invaded. 13.1 Country activation. When a country activates, determine the faction it joins at 13.1.1, remove any pro-faction, or strict neutrality marker in it, and then set up its counters per country setup at 13.1.2. 13.1.1 Faction determination. A rule, or event that activates a country may state which faction it joins. If it does not state which faction, do the following. If an allied faction declared war, it joins the Axis faction, regardless of any pro-faction marker that may be in it. If the Axis faction declared war, check the following in the order listed until the allied faction is determined. If the country contains a pro-Soviet or pro-Western marker in it, it joins that allied faction. If appeasement is in effect and both the Nazi-Soviet Pact and Moscow Treaty are not in effect, it joins the Soviet faction. If appeasement is not in effect and either the Nazi-Soviet Pact or Moscow Treaty is in effect, it joins the Western faction. If none of the above applies, roll a die. If the result is 1 to 3, the country joins the Western faction. If 4 to 6, it joins the Soviet faction. 13.1.2 Country setup. The activated country's units and markers are placed as follows. National wall markers are put on the national wall track matching the country's value shown in the country list as 16.0. The activated country's national wall is not affected if it has a disputed area that was ceded to another country, 2.2. Production markers are put on the production track. A Prod X2 marker, if any, is put in the production multiplier box. Then determine the country's production points, 9.1.1. Event markers are put in its faction card's events box. The owning faction chooses one of the two setup methods below, and then places the country's units as indicated. A counter with a triangle symbol is a what-if counter of 3.0, and is not set up or used unless playing with an official game expansion and not included in this game, or unofficial player modification. Off-map setup. Put all of the country's units in its faction card's mobilization box. This gives the Axis faction a way to prevent the East or West invaded conditional event due to the activation of a country which triggers that event. On map setup, first look at country setup special cases 13.1.2.1 below to see if it applies for the activated country. If it does not apply, place the activated country's counters as follows. A ground unit is placed at full strength and full supply in a land hex. An air unit is placed with no sorties in a city, fort, or transport line hex. A naval unit is placed with no sorties in a port hex. All placements must be in within the activated country's mainland and or overseas areas. A unit must be placed in a hex from which it is able to trace a supply line 7.4 back to a supply source 7.3 for that unit. If the supply line is traced across a C-zone or map box, it cannot be intercepted, and the convoy used is not activated. Just confirm that a valid supply line can be traced. Units may set up stacked, but cannot violate stacking limits. 13.1.2.1 Country setup special cases. The following countries have specific setup rules if they are activated. French North Africa, Syria, or Vichy. When one of these countries activates, its faction rolls a die for it. Add +1 DM for each of these countries that are conquered. The Vichy countries had decreasing levels of resistance with each conquest of its territories. If the result is 1 to 3, set up the country using country setup a 13.1.2. If the result is 4 to 6, the country is considered conquered by the phasing faction a 13.2.2. Instead of performing the steps under 13.2.2, all the country's counters are removed from the scenario. Example, it is August 44. French North Africa and Syria are conquered. The Western faction declares war on Vichy. The Axis faction rolls a die and adds +2. The final result is 5, so Vichy is conquered by the Western faction, and its counters are removed. 36 Unconditional surrender to any edition use 2 rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. Italy, use country setup a 13.1.2, but no more than 3 field ground units may be set up in Italy's overseas areas. The Tobruk fort is put in hex 5339, even if using off-map setup above. Note that even if using off-map setup, placing the Tobruk fort marker triggers the Mediterranean Crisis Conditional Event 13.4. Ussr, its units are placed as per scenario instructions. 13.2 Country collapse. A country immediately collapses if its national will drops to 0, or all of its mainland cities are under enemy control. Exception, the USSR cannot collapse if the current turn is 1943 or later. A country that collapses without being conquered remains an active country 2.1.1. An active country can collapse multiple times per scenario. Exception, the UK or USA can collapse only one time. When a country collapses, if at least one of its mainland cities is under enemy control, and there is an enemy ground unit in its mainland area, the country is conquered. Exception, the UK, USA, or USSR can collapse, but it is never considered conquered. If a country is conquered, see conquered country a 13.2.2. Each time a country collapses without being conquered, do the following. Exceptions, UK, USA, or USSR 13.2.1.1. 13.2.1 Country collapse procedure. Step 1. Each of its reduced ground units in a hex or map box is put in its faction cards eliminated box. Then, each of its full-strength ground units is reduced. Also, each of its air or naval units in a hex or map box has its sorties removed, and is put in its faction cards eliminated box. Step 2. Reset its national will to 1/2 of the value shown for that country in the country list 16.0. Roundup. 13.2.1.1 Country collapse procedure. Special cases. The goal of these special cases is to keep the game from ending right away should an allied faction's major power collapse. UK or USA. When the UK or USA collapses, do the following. Step 1. Each of the collapsed country's reduced ground units in a hex or map box is put in its faction cards eliminated box. Then, each of its full-strength ground units is reduced. Also, each of its air or naval units in a hex or map box has its sorties removed, and is put in its faction cards eliminated box. Step 2. Remove its national will markers from the scenario. It no longer tracks its own will and cannot collapse again. Step 3. To take 1 German ground unit from its faction cards conditional box, and put it in the eliminated box. Step 4. Increase Germany's national will by 16. Step 5. For the Axis faction may select any one neutral country, and apply an unrestricted political success event to it 14.12. It also puts a pro-Axis marker in the diplomacy cup. USSR. When the USSR collapses, do the following. Step 1. Each USSR reduced ground unit in a hex or map box is put in its faction cards eliminated box. Then, each of its full-strength ground units is reduced. Also, each of its air or naval units in a hex or map box has its sorties removed, and is put in its faction cards eliminated box. Each USSR fort within the USSR is removed from the scenario. Step 2. The occupied Russia disputed area border within the USSR goes into effect. The area west of that border, and all USSR disputed areas that were ceded to the USSR are considered occupied USSR. The area to the east, and the central Russia box remain the active USSR. Though the USSR can collapse multiple times, the only territory the Axis gets each time is the occupied USSR area. Step 3. Put an Axis control marker in each occupied USSR city that does not have one even if it has a Soviet unit or marker, and remove all Axis control markers within the active USSR, even if it has an Axis unit or marker. Step 4. First, the Axis faction repatriates a 10.4 all its units and markers from within the active USSR. A repatriated German unit must be placed within occupied USSR instead of Germany, even if the hex has a Soviet unit, East-Dosi, or marker. Second, the Soviet faction repatriates all its units and markers from within occupied USSR. It then repatriates all USSR units and markers in a hex outside of the USSR. A repatriated USSR unit is put within the active USSR only. When all repatriation is done, no Axis or USSR unit within occupied USSR or the active USSR can be activated in the current operations phase. End any currently activated units activation. Axis forces are too busy establishing control, and the Soviet forces are too disorganized. Step 5. To take the USSR FAC lost marker from its on-map factory count track, and put it in its faction cards conditional box. While in the conditional box, there is no strategic warfare fought with the Soviet faction. Step 6. To take 1 German ground unit from its faction cards conditional box, and put it in the eliminated box. Step 7. Increase Germany's national will by 16. This step only happens the first time the USSR collapses. Step 8. Put the Moscow Treaty marker on the turn track in the December turn of the following year. Exception, if the current turn is in 1942, and the scenario ends marker is in the dual 44 turn, put the Moscow Treaty in the June 43 turn. Example, USSR collapses in August 42. If scenario ends is in July 45, Moscow Treaty goes in December 43. If scenario ends is in July 44, Moscow Treaty goes in December 42. The Moscow Treaty Policy, 10.3.6, goes into effect. While the policy is in effect, occupied USSR is considered a conquered country. Exception, occupied USSR is part of the active USSR for purposes of the political failure 14.11 or political success 14.12 event. When the Moscow Treaty Policy ends, occupied USSR becomes part of the active USSR again. Step 9. The Axis faction may select any one neutral country and apply an unrestricted political success event to it 14.12. It also puts a pro-Axis marker in the diplomacy cup. 13.2.2 Conquered country. A country is considered conquered by the phasing faction, regardless of which faction caused the collapse. After a country is conquered, it becomes inactive and is considered conquered for the rest of the scenario. Unconditional Surrender 2nd edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx 37. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. This is true even if the faction it belongs to retakes all its cities. You can still feel proud for liberating your ally. Important, until an enemy unit moves into a conquered country's city, that city is still friendly to the faction that controlled it at the time the country collapsed. Occupation takes soldiers and time. If a country is conquered, do the following. Exception, France. See Conquered Country Special Cases of 13.2.2.1. Step 1. Remove all of the conquered country's counters from the scenario. Step 2. The faction that conquered the country puts a friendly pro-faction marker in the diplomacy cup and may do one of the following. Select any one neutral country that has an enemy pro-faction or strict neutrality marker in its capital hex and remove it. Select one neutral country that has no pro-faction or strict neutrality marker in it and which shares a land border 1.3.4 with the just conquered country. Put a friendly pro-faction marker in its capital hex. For this option, use the border in effect before a disputed area is ceded in a step below. Step 3. If the Axis faction conquered a country. Put the conquered countries will one's marker in the Axis faction card's conquered allied countries box. The number of countries the Axis conquers impacts the strategic warfare DM. The markers in this box serve as a reminder of how many were conquered. Take one German ground unit from its faction card's conditional box and put it in the eliminated box. Increase Germany's national will by 2. Exception, if Italy was conquered, increase it by 8. If Italy was conquered, put a pro-Axis marker in the diplomacy cup. This is in addition to the marker put in the cup in step 2. If Poland was conquered, the Polish corridor disputed area is ceded to Germany. If an Axis unit to accept a German unit is in this area at this time, it is repatriated to 10.4. Also, if the Nazi-Soviet pact policy is in effect, do the following in the order listed. In Axis and Western order, each faction repatriates a 10.4 of all its counters in the Eastern Poland disputed area. The Eastern Poland disputed area is ceded to the USSR and USSR national will is increased by 2. This represents the USSR invading Eastern Poland. Take one USSR ground unit from its faction card's conditional box and put it in the eliminated box. Step 4. If the Soviet faction conquered a country. If the East invaded event of 13.3 has not occurred, take one USSR ground unit from its faction card's conditional box and put it in its eliminated box. If Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania was conquered, that whole country is ceded to the USSR and increase the USSR's national will by 2. If Finland, Poland, or Romania was conquered, that country's USSR disputed area is ceded to the USSR and increase the USSR's national will by 2. Step 5. If an allied faction conquered a country belonging to the other allied faction, the Axis faction performs step 2 and the second, third, and fourth bullets of step 3. This prevents the allies from denying these benefits to the Axis by conquering each other's countries. 13.2.2.1 Conquered country special cases. France. Replace the conquered country steps with the following. Step 1. Remove France's counters from the scenario, but put the France will one's marker in the Axis faction card's conquered allied countries box. Step 2. The Axis faction may select any one neutral country and apply an unrestricted political success event to it 14.12. It also puts a pro-Axis marker in the diplomacy cup. Step 3. To take the Western, Free Forces and Partisans markers from their faction card's conditional box. If the East invaded event of 13.3 has occurred, put them 6 turns later on the turn track. If East invaded has not occurred, put the Free Forces marker 6 turns later on the turn track and the Partisans marker 18 turns later on the turn track. Step 4. The Alsace-Lorraine disputed area is ceded to Germany. If an Axis unit to accept a German unit is in this area at this time, it is repatriated to 10.4. Step 5. To take one German ground unit from its faction card's conditional box and put it in its eliminated box. Step 6. Increase Germany's national will by 8. If the Nazi-Soviet pact is in effect, add the following steps. Step 7. The disputed area border within France goes into effect. The occupied France area of France remains France and is a conquered country. France is no longer an active country, even if the West takes back its cities. Step 8. To the neutral countries of French North Africa, a capital is Tunis, Syria a capital is Damascus, and Vichy a capital is Vichy, are created. Historically, they were all Vichy. However, control was very local, and so for game purposes, they are divided into separate countries. In Axis and Western order, each faction repatriates a 10.4 of all its counters in these countries. 13.3 East invaded. This event occurs the first time either of the following happens. It can occur only one time in a scenario. An Axis unit or marker attacks into, moves into, or is placed in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or USSR, or in Poland, but only if Poland is an active Axis country. The USA activates as a Western country. If this event occurs in a phasing Axis factions operations phase, perform the following in the order listed at the end of that Axis operations phase. Example, it is June 41, and in the Axis factions operations phase, a German air unit attacks a USSR air unit. The East invaded events are performed at the end of the June 41 Axis factions operations phase. 38 Unconditional surrender to any edition tilde use 2 rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. If it occurs any other time, perform them at the end of the next Axis operations phase that is played. Example, it is October 40, and in the diplomacy phase, Latvia activates as an Axis country. Latvia's ground unit is set up in Riga. The East invaded events are performed at the end of the November 40 Axis factions operations phase. Axis political success, the Axis faction may select any one neutral country that ceded a disputed area to the USSR and apply the political success event to it. 14.12. Emergency mobilization, the Soviet faction takes 1 USSR air and 5 USSR ground units from their faction cards conditional box and mobilizes them as per mobilization. 8.3. This does not cost production points. The units are at full supply. Lend-lease to USSR, if the West invaded event, 13.8 has occurred, take the Lend-lease to USSR markers from their faction cards conditional box and put them 6 turns later on the turn track. If West invaded event has not occurred, put these markers 12 turns later on the turn track. Policy evaluation, if the appeasement or Nazi-Soviet pact policy is in effect, and the policy evaluation marker is not on the turn track, put that marker 13 turns later on the turn track. Reserves, take 4 USSR ground units, and 1 tanks marker from their faction cards conditional box, and put them 6 turns later on the turn track. For each ceded a disputed area marker in the Soviet faction cards conditional box, if any, take 1 USSR ground unit in its faction cards conditional box, and put it in its eliminated box. Russian winter, take the Russian winter marker from its faction cards conditional box, and put it on the turn track in the December turn following the current turn. Soviet partisans, take the Soviet partisans markers from their faction cards conditional box. Put one 6 turns later on the turn track, and the other one 18 turns later on the turn track. Strategic warfare, take the USSR FAC lost marker from its faction cards conditional box, and put it in its on-map factory count tracks 1 box. Also, if the Germany FAC lost marker is not on the on-map factory count track, take it from its faction cards conditional box, and put it in its on-map factory count tracks 1 box. Surprise attack, take the USSR surprise attack markers from their faction cards conditional box. If the USA is not an active country, put 1 each in the January boxes 3 and 4 years later on the turn track. If the USA is active, put 1 each in the January boxes 2 and 3 years later. Example, East invaded occurs in June 41, and the USA is not an active country. 1 USSR surprise attack marker is put in the Jan 44 turn track box. The other is put in the Jan 45 box. Urals factories, take the Urals FAC markers from their faction cards conditional box, and put them on the next turn on the turn track. 13.4 Mediterranean crisis. This event occurs the first time either of the following happens. This event can occur only one time in a scenario. An Axis unit or marker attacks into, moves into, or is placed in a France or UK, overseas area, or in any area of any country, except a France or UK, mainland area that shares a border with a France or UK, overseas area. Example, France has been conquered, Syria has become a neutral country of 13.2.2.1, and Turkey is a Western country. An Axis unit moving into Turkey triggers this event because Turkey shares a border with Cyprus, a UK overseas area. The France or UK, mainland area exception prevents the invasion of continental France or Great Britain from triggering this event due to the border shared by Syria, while it is part of France and Palestine, an UK overseas area. The USA activates as a Western country. When this event occurs, the Western faction immediately does the following in any order. The Western faction can wait until a newly activated Axis country has set up all its units before doing this. French reserves, take all French ground units from their faction cards conditional box, and put them in any hex in a France overseas area. This does not cost production points. Placement cannot violate stacking limits. The units are at full supply. UK reserves, take all UK ground units in their faction cards conditional box, and put them in any hex in a UK overseas area except Egypt. This does not cost production points. Placement cannot violate stacking limits. The units are at full supply. Emergency shipping, the Western faction may take 1 UK convoy unit, and or 1 French convoy unit from any port, and put it in a friendly port in a UK overseas area or France overseas area. No movement path is traced. The placement cannot be intercepted, and cannot violate stacking limits. 13.5 USA entry when both the appeasement and Nazi-Soviet pact policies have ended, put the USA entry marker 6 turns later on the turn track. Also, see USA entry of 15.29.